Okay, can you see the screen? Great.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I also wanted to thank Ms. Shanika Davis, who initially reached out to me to invite me to present to you all this morning, as well as to Ms. Melinda Pacheco, who helped coordinate the logistics for this grand rounds. So my area of expertise is in racial disparities in adverse birth outcomes. And so I will be talking with you today about understanding some of the key factors that help us understand the persistently higher rates among African American women in low birth weight, preterm delivery, and infant death as compared to the non-Hispanic white population, as well as other major racial and ethnic groups. And this is a long-standing public health issue that has really been on the radar for quite a long time, and there have been different approaches across time for how to understand what's happening with these population health disparities. And more recently, disparities in maternal mortality have really sort of come to the fore, especially where the disparities there are actually larger than they are with the adverse birth outcomes and infant mortality. And certainly when we are seeing moms die in this day and age, that is definitely a concern. And when we're seeing the maternal mortality rate decrease in other industrialized countries while it is increasing here, that makes it even a larger concern. So I'm going to be focused mainly on the infant outcomes today, but if you have any questions around maternal mortality related issues, that's not as much in my area, my wheelhouse, but I'm definitely keeping up on the literature there. Okay, so let's see, let me go to there we go. All right, so the objectives today for this grand rounds, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have my timer start as well. Okay, first is at the completion of the presentation, hopefully you all will be able to explain 2 reasons why racism, not race, is considered a fundamental determinant of racial disparities in pregnancy-related health. And then 2, describe action steps for addressing racism, describe 2 action steps for addressing racism as a fundamental determinant of racial disparities in pregnancy-related health. Okay, so Healthy People 2030, as you all probably know, Healthy People is the country's public health agenda, right? It is a decades-long plan for improving the population health of our country. And the vision for Healthy People 2030 is a society in which all people can achieve their full potential for health and well-being across the lifespan. And as part of getting to this vision, right, having this vision come to fruition, there are several goals that are part of Healthy People 2030, and I'm just going to focus on 2 of the key ones. First one is eliminate disparities, health disparities, and then the second is achieve health equity. So we want to look a little bit more closely at these 2. So health disparities are considered to be persistent, avoidable, and therefore unfair health differences between socially advantaged and socially disadvantaged groups. And the reason that we have health disparities is because we do not have health equity. Health equity is one of the goals, again, right? These are the things we want to try to get to. We want to eliminate the disparities and we want to achieve health equity. So we have disparities because we don't have health equity. Health equity is that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be healthy. The reason we don't have health equity, that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be healthy, is because we don't have social equity. And that is that everyone has a fair and just opportunity, right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with Kamara Jones. She is a medical doctor. She is at Morehouse School of Medicine, and she is the former president of the American Public Health Association. And the sort of the platform for her tenure as president of APHA was really a focus on racism as a fundamental determinant of racial disparities in health outcomes. And she was really pushing for a national conversation around race and around racism, which this past year, which has been quite an eventful year, to say the least. Certainly we saw how racism was front and center on the, the public's mind, in the media, in the wake of, I think, in the wake of George Floyd's murder in particular, that sparked global protests and sort of this a new generation's civil rights movement, really. These issues of race and racism and our continued struggle with them certainly were front and center. And I think we're sort of at this point, sort of an inflection point, I think, in a lot of ways in our country, because of things that have happened in the past, few years, where the reality of just how deeply entrenched social inequities are in our country have really come to the fore. COVID has definitely shown that, as well as, when we sort of watched in real time through cell phone video, right, as an African-American man was murdered right in front of us by the police. So these issues of social inequity are really fundamental to understanding the issues of health inequity and health disparities that we're going to be talking about today. So this sort of graphic that I have in front of you was developed by Dr. Kamara Jones, and it's in her in an article called The Cliff of Good Health, if anybody's interested in it. And by the way, I didn't include a citation slide, and I'm willing to share the PowerPoint for people who are interested, and I know this is being recorded. But if there's anything in here, where you'd like to know what the citation is or the full citation, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to, follow up in any way. So I'm going to go through this rather quickly, walk you through it, but we're going to start over here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you see me moving my mouse? Okay, all right, so this is where we're gonna start. And what you see here is, sort of in little kid stick figure drawings, right? But big ideas behind this. So this is supposed to be, these lines here are supposed to be a cliff. And you have two populations who are sort of walking along the cliff, okay? You have the orange population and you have the green population. Notice that the green population is closer to the edge of the cliff than the orange population. Also notice that on the orange population side of the cliff, there seems to be a fence that's been erected. And on the green population side, there's nothing to stop them from falling off the edge of the cliff, okay? So we start over here when thinking about social inequity. Social inequity leads to differences in access to social resources. And this is based on those factors that tend to be factors in our society that divide us. And the whole issue of divisiveness has also been very big, right, this year and in the past 4 years, where we've seen how differences in class, differences in race, differences in gender, right? Differences in sexual orientation and gender identity have really been utilized in a lot of ways to create divisions among the population and among political lines. So these isms are the foundation of social inequity in our country and become points at which resources get distributed. based on where you fall sort of in the social hierarchy, right? So we have, once you have these social differences in resources, resource distribution, then you have differences in how populations are able to keep themselves healthy, right? How they are able to have access to resources, fair and just access to resources, in order to help them achieve their general life goals, as well as to help them achieve their health goals. So you end up with differences in exposures, negative exposures to things that may cause you ill health, as well as differences in exposures to opportunities or things that can, improve your health. You also, because of that, you have differences in resources, that lead to differences in exposures and opportunities, which also then affects your level of vulnerability to actually becoming sick if you were to get exposed, right? Then you have, once you get close to the edge of the cliff, to fall off the cliff of good health, if you are the orange population, first of all, see that the orange population is much further back from the edge of the cliff than the green population. The orange population is the privileged population. This is the socially advantaged population that has a larger share of the social resources. So their risk for falling off the cliff of good health is much lower than the risk of the green population, which is much closer to the edge. Now, if the green populations should fall off this cliff because they don't have a fence, right, to stop them from falling off the cliff, which is sort of a primary prevention approach. We want to prevent people from getting sick, right? They're more likely to get sick. And when they fall off of this cliff, they're going to fall all the way down to the bottom. So when there's differences in access to resources, differences in exposures and opportunities to be healthy, which increases your vulnerability to becoming ill. Then when you need some medical attention, healthcare, when you need help once you get sick, there can also be differences in access to care. So the green population, we'll start with the orange population. The orange population has a fence, primary prevention. If they fall through the fence for some reason, they are going to encounter a trampoline halfway down the cliff, which is secondary prevention, right? That you won't be able to prevent you getting sick, but if you get sick, you have health care, primary health care or whatever it may be, to be able to help you or attention, in order to help you address whatever the issue is before it gets to be really bad, right? You have access to resources, health insurance, whatever it may be, that you can go and see someone if you get ill. And so you would bounce off of this trampoline back up to the top of the cliff of good health. And if you were to get really sick or have an emergency health situation, you would have easy access to emergency care and ambulance services and, a hospital that's relatively nearby and that sort of thing. So as opposed to the green population, which may not have primary prevention, which may not have easy access to health insurance and easy access to being able to see a doctor when they need to, and then having to fall all the way down to the bottom of the cliff of good health, where they may get emergency care, emergency services, but the response times may not be as quick, for example, or they may have to wait because they don't have access to health insurance for much longer time before they try to access, right, those tertiary services. And then once you have access to services, then the issue of quality of care becomes a concern, right? Just because you have access doesn't mean that the kinds of care, the quality of care, the treatment that you're getting is going to be equitable across the board. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. All right, so in shifting to looking at how these factors all apply to understanding disparities in adverse birth outcomes. In the US, about 6 babies out of every 1,000 babies who are born alive die before their first birth date. And of course, all of you know that infant mortality is the death of a live-born infant, right, within the first year of life. So 6 babies out of 1,000 doesn't seem just on the surface of it to be a large number. But when you look at how we rank as a nation compared to other industrialized countries in infant mortality, we do not do that well. So we spend the most of any country on the planet in healthcare, but we rank behind 26 other industrialized countries in infant mortality. And if we were to look at African Americans as a population, their own country, they would rank behind 91 other countries in infant death. You can see there's a huge disparity there. Infant mortality has been labeled the most sensitive index that we possess of social welfare. We know infant mortality is a global indicator of population health, but it has been understood to really be indicative of how well a society as a whole is functioning, not simply what the health of the population is. And in the United States, leading causes of infant mortality are preterm delivery and low birth weight. And we know that babies who are born preterm or low birth weight are a much higher risk for health and developmental issues across their life course, not just in childhood. Low birth weight and preterm delivery have been linked to chronic disease in older adulthood, in particular cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, and even dementia. So understanding racial disparities, African American babies are about 2 to 3 times, depending on where you are, more likely to be born low birth weight or preterm or to die in their first year of life. So how can we understand this? Medical risk, health behavior, and socioeconomic status tend to be the immediate things that come to people's mind to help us understand or explain this difference in risk. So the first thing is, well, you know, African American women may be at higher medical risk. They may come into a pregnancy with a chronic medical condition. It may be undiagnosed, but they may have, you know, worse general health, typically because of lower socioeconomic status or access to health insurance or you know, a variety of different things. But when we look at the research and you control for medical risk, you take that into account, disparities still show up in the data, right? So medical risk does not explain the differences in these adverse outcomes. Health behaviors. That's another thought is, well, perhaps African American women are not getting into prenatal care you know, in time in that first trimester. They're not going consistently, you know, for example, maybe they're doing other things. They're not taking care of themselves. They may not have, you know, the best diets, or they may not exercise, you know, moderately. There may be a variety of different behavioral issues that relate to their, you know, higher risk for having an adverse birth outcome. Even when you take that into account, though, we find that health behavior does not explain away the disparities either. So the next thing is socioeconomic status. There's a very strong correlation between socioeconomics and health. The more socioeconomic resources you have, the better your health tends to be. And this tends to be a graded relationship, right? So each step up the socioeconomic ladder is associated with a bump up in your health status. And we know that we have deep socioeconomic divisions in our country. We know that we've got sort of the 1%, right, at the top, whose wealth is continuing to grow. And then there's the rest of us, right, very far behind that 1%. You know, we have sort of a shrinking middle class, a true sort of middle class. Our socioeconomic disparities are actually increasing over time. And on top of that, then racial differences in socioeconomic standing. And we know that populations of color have generally lower wealth and lower economic resources than the majority population, non-Hispanic whites. So another concern is, well, we know there's this strong graded relationship between socioeconomic status and health, and we know that African Americans tend to have lower socioeconomic status than the majority population, and so maybe that's what's the driving sort of factor, and it could also be related to factors like health behavior and medical risk, right? Well, even when we take socioeconomics into account, it still does not explain away the disparity in adverse birth outcomes. And in fact, there is a paradoxical relationship that we see with socioeconomic status, in that the gap between African American women and non-Hispanic white women in pregnancy outcomes is actually larger as you move up the socioeconomic spectrum. So the difference between high SES African American women and high SES white women in terms of their pregnancy outcomes is actually larger than it is at lower levels of the socioeconomic ladder, which kind of seems counterintuitive if health is supposed to improve, right, as you, with greater socioeconomic resources. Okay, so these are sort of the common things that people think about as reasons why Black women may be at higher risk for adverse birth outcomes. And they don't explain away the difference. So another argument that's been put forth is genetics, right? And actually I want to go back one more slide and just say something else about this slide in particular. The things that I was talking about in terms of perceptions of maybe medical risk or health behavior, that maybe Black women have higher, chronic health issues or greater behavioral issues and maybe not taking care of themselves. These are perceptions that may be out there. They may not be reality. And so I just want to make sure to distinguish that. When you sort of present this information to people who are maybe hearing it for the first time, and they start to think about, well, what can be sort of behind that, we tend to automatically go to sort of a victim blaming sort of mentality and think about, well, what is it that they're doing wrong, right? Or what is it that's wrong with them that is contributing to, their poorer health outcomes? Similar kinds of conversations we were seeing around COVID, right? When we were learning about the disparities, which were not at all surprising, by the way, to those of us who understand, that these are longstanding issues. There was all this talk initially around why it was that Black and brown populations were at higher risk for exposure, higher risk for death, and those sorts of things. And we had conversations around things like, well, higher rates of chronic illness because they don't have great diets and they're not taking care of themselves and they don't have it and they don't and they don't and they don't. And it was very much came across very much as a victim blaming, or what is it that they're doing wrong, sort of way of conceptualizing or thinking about the problem initially, until we got more public health folks in there talking about sort of the larger contextual issues and social determinants of health, which we'll be getting into in just a minute, and long-standing systems of oppression and social inequity that have actually created and perpetuated what we're seeing in terms of health outcomes, right? The health outcomes are just a physical health consequence of long-standing social inequities. Okay, so getting to the genetics question. This is another sort of explanation that has been posited by some as what could be behind the disparities. And this is I know it's a little bit fuzzy to see here, but it is a graph that is from a classic study that Jimmy Collins and Dick David out of Chicago did in the late 90s, where they used vital statistics data on all of the births that had occurred in Illinois during the particular year, and they mapped out the birth weight distributions of the infants that were born by whether they were non-Hispanic white infants, they were African American infants, or they were African infants born to African immigrant women. And I've highlighted the yellow line there. That line is the African American birth weight distribution. And you see the other two lines virtually overlap, right? That is the African immigrant birth weight distribution and the US born whites distribution. And you see they virtually overlap. So the question of whether or not there is something inherent to Black women, inherent to their genes, that predisposes them to having higher rates of adverse birth outcomes seems to be undermined by this kind of data, where you're seeing that in African-born women who are having babies in the United States, their birth weight distributions look virtually the same as non-Hispanic white women's. But African-American women's birth weight distribution significantly shifted down from both of those populations. And so these authors speculated that what we were seeing here is a difference in the context, right? The social context. African-American women being born and raised within a social context with a history of slavery and forced migration and of social denigration, right, through racism in our country. And African-born immigrants to this country, you know, not having been subjected to that kind of longstanding socio-political history. And then there's the whole sort of hypothesis around the healthy immigrant effect, right? Who is it that actually immigrates? But what we see is once immigrants have their babies here, they tend to look really good in terms of their birth outcomes. But the longer they're here, the worse their health becomes. And when you look at the second generation, the babies born to these African immigrants who grow up in the United States and have babies, their birth weight distributions are significantly shifted down from that of the previous generation of their moms. And that's another study that Collins and David also looked at. So that's just one sort of factor that sort of is counter to a genetics explanation. Besides this, the fact that genetics function very specifically, and we're looking at differences in birth outcomes, both in low birth weight and in preterm delivery and in infant death. And there's a whole variety of different reasons or factors why those things might happen. And not just in differences in infant outcomes, we see differences across the health spectrum, across the life course, health disparities. It's very sort of consistent. So there's also that argument against genetics. And then there's also the argument that there are differences in the gap, the black-white gap in these outcomes, not only by sort of nativity status, also by acculturation, I had also mentioned by generation, and by time and place. So if you look at the gap across time, in more socially conservative times, the gap is larger than it is in more socially progressive times. And you can also look at it geographically. So the gap is different in different parts of the country, right? And even within a state or even within a city, the gap can be very different depending on where you are geographically in the area. So this shows you that the racial gap is not sort of something that is a foregone conclusion. It's not something that is sort of a naturally occurring thing. It's malleable. It changes over time. It differs by a variety of different kinds of factors. And so this has led a lot of folks in this area trying to understand these disparities and address them to really focus in on the more contextual factors, the issues around the environment, the social environment in which people are living, working, and playing. So this is a quote from Nancy Krieger, who is a well-known social epidemiologist at Harvard. And this is a quote out of a PBS documentary series that was done several years ago, Unnatural Causes: Is Inequality Making Us Sick? And she talks about how there's one view of us as biological, right? Biological creatures. We're determined by our genes. And what that misses is that we carry our history in our body. We carry our history in our bodies. How can we not? So we have sort of shifted over time from a primary focus or emphasis on a medical model way of understanding these issues, looking at sort of the health behaviors and the health care and the prenatal care and those sorts of things, risk factors, medical risk factors, really focusing at sort of an individual level around trying to understanding a long-standing population health difference. And there's been this shift to a more ecological perspective, a more contextual perspective, and understanding that people live their lives embedded in social environments. We are social beings. We cannot function without, right, each other in some way, shape, or form. We are part and parcel of community. And so we have to think about and understanding behavior, understanding health status, right? We have to understand the context within which that person is functioning, the context in which that person has been born and raised and developed over time. And so this comes out of developmental psychology. This is what I'm showing you here, the ecological paradigm as first formulated by Yuri Bronfenbrenner, a developmental psychologist, really showing that there are multiple layers of social environment that encircle us throughout our entire lives. We're born into in a social environment, right? Born into some sort of family system, for example, and then we engage with the social environment throughout our entire lives in a variety of different ways. And it can have a profound influence on our health and well-being. So, kind of emanating from this model of the ecological perspective are the social determinants of health. This is the context of our lives, the determinants of health that are outside of our genetics, outside of individual behaviors, for example, factors that affect where we live, where we work, where we play, who it is that we engage with. All of those different factors have an influence on our health. Okay, one key social determinant of health that is thought to be a fundamental underlying cause of the racial differences that we're seeing in adverse birth outcomes is racism. One of those isms that I showed you in that first Cliff of Good Health graphic, where that is a fundamental to social inequity in our country, right? Racism is one of the key factors, upon which we have been divided in this country for a very, very long time. So racism is considered to be a pervasive system of power that structures opportunities and assigns value based on the social construction of race, which unfairly advantages some and unfairly disadvantages others based on ideological notions of inherent superiority and inferiority. So this social construction of race is a really important factor to understand how racism operates, right? The idea is that racism is, first of all, that race is not a true biological construct in the way that we traditionally have thought about it. It has actually been a whole variety of different disciplines have really sort of debunked this idea that there is sort of true genetic differences between different population groups. In fact, there have been studies that have shown that there's greater genetic differences within groups than there are between them. So racism, this concept of race also is a concept that has changed over time. The way that we classify people, for example, in terms of their racial group, right? Ever since we started doing a census in this country, 1790, the racial group classifications change every single year. So it's like race is this moving target, right? And we sort of redefine things based on how they best sort of help how they best advantage certain groups during certain times. So as different European groups, for example, immigrated to the United States, they weren't immediately sort of embraced and welcomed right into the majority white population. They were seen as, you know, sort of foreign groups. But over time, they've been, you know, sort of welcomed into or folded into the category called white, which has led to the white population being, you know, a majority population. But those groups were not initially considered to be white. They were not initially considered to be, you know, sort of part of the dominant racial group, you know, at the time when they first started immigrating. Thinking about, you know, Italians, for example, you know, the Irish, a whole host of different European groups. And it's the same thing now for Latinos, right? This is something we all did at the census this past year as well. And one thing my husband, who is Mexican American, you know, always sort of laughs about when he gets to that race question or ethnicity question, the first thing, you know, is ethnicity. Are you Hispanic or not, right? Are you, and then it asks your race, right? Are you white, black, you know, all the different options. And he always has a really hard time answering that race question. And he tends to actually just write in, you know, under other, Mexican American, because he does not consider himself, he does not identify with being white, although that is the way that we classify people now, right? We separate out ethnicity, you're Hispanic or not, and then what is your racial group? So, and that also is, you know, relatively new. That's not the way that we've always classified people. So racism has a very strong, or race has a very strong social story behind it. And the sort of this concept of there being inherent differences between groups, particularly around between African Americans and the majority population, was really a socio-political tool that was utilized to help justify slavery and to help justify the horrendous conditions and treatment of people who looked different, right? So racism is not about how you look, it's about how people assign meaning to how you look. And there are different types or levels of racism. Just checking my time here real quick. Institutionalized, which has to do with you know, sort of our structures, our institutions, organizations, our policies, how social inequity gets embedded into policies, residential segregation, for example, educational segregation, things like this where there may be zoning laws, or there may be differences in lending policies and practices for who can, you know, get home loans and who can purchase where, and those sorts of things. That's institutionalized racism. Interpersonal is what it is that we typically think about, right? Sort of that, you know, somebody calls you, you know, a racial epithet of some sort, or you feel that you've been slighted or discriminated against in some way by another person. And then internalized racism, that is sort of the acceptance, the internalization of negative stereotypes about your group, which then can affect the way that you start to see your group or even think about yourself. Self-reported racism, and this is typically interpersonal experiences of racism, perceived racism experiences, has been linked in research to a whole host of mental, physical, and behavioral health outcomes that I've listed here. And then when we have done work with women in focus groups around their experiences in racism, and we're finding that they talk about racism that has been experienced across their life course, across different domains of their life. So it doesn't just happen, for example, at work. It happens when they're in the grocery store. It happens when they're walking down the street. It happens if they have to engage with the police, for example. It happens in a variety of different life domains. It's experienced across those different levels: institutionalized racism, interpersonal racism, internalized racism. Things like mothers talking about how they may try to get their children into the white school because the white school is better. Right. And they don't want their kids to go to the neighborhood, sort of school that's predominantly kids of color, because they know they're not going to get, sort of the best education. So you sort of have a combination of sort of that institutionalized racism that they're recognizing, but also that sense of, sort of that Black and brown school it's not good enough. Right. And so my kids need the white school. That's just an example of some of the things that we've heard in focus groups that we've conducted. And these are real sort of struggles that Black moms have with childbearing. The questions around, first of all, there may be ambivalence about getting pregnant, about bringing a Black child into this world, knowing what it is that child is going to be subjected to, right, in this country. And you may see that even during the course of pregnancy, when women they've talked about in focus groups we've had with them about ambivalence during pregnancy and just fear for what it is that their kids may experience and what it is they're going to be up against as a parent in terms of trying to prepare that child, right, to live in a world that does not value them equally. So racism experienced across levels, direct and vicarious experiences, active and passive responses to racism, and then pervasive vigilance. This is another big one. And I was part of published article where we looked at worry about racism and its connection to preterm birth, and found that just worrying that you might be discriminated against or you might encounter racism during the course of your day was enough to make a difference in terms of your risk for preterm birth. So you don't even have to experience it. It's just the sort of worry about it or the vigilance about anticipating that it could happen, which walk outside your door and it can happen, right? This is sort of the sense of the experience that these women have had. It's not just racism we have to think about. We have to also think about intersectional identities. So African American women have both a racial identity that is a source of social exclusion or sort of social difference. And then there are also women, which is another, sort of source of social difference. And then you have the class, you can bring in the class issues we talked about before with these great socioeconomic disparities that we have in our country as well. And if you sort of put those all together, you see that there are sort of overlapping oppressions that could be operating. These are all socially, part of the social ecology of women's lives that they're having to sort of manage and deal with. Not only, are they, racial, ethnic minorities, but they're also women in a historically patriarchal society, and they're also more likely to have fewer socioeconomic resources and opportunities. So these are overlapping oppressions that can lead to greater levels of stress, and sort of thinking about how do these social factors, the social ecology, translate into higher risk for adverse health outcomes, right? So what sort of is that mechanism? And for us, we look at stress, life demands that challenge or challenges that tax or exceed a person's ability to adapt, and therefore increases their health risk. And we know that stress is associated with a host of biological factors, biological processes, biological systems that then can impact health adversely. So as stress goes up, your health is going to be impacted. Allostatic load or weathering is a concept that relates to the physiological toll that chronic stress can have on the body. And this is really capturing what sort of that mechanism, that stress mechanism is that we're thinking that is responsible for sort of these long-term, long-standing health disparities as a result of long-standing social inequity, right? The stress of those overlapping oppressions, this chronic, sort of exposure to that means that our stress system becomes chronically engaged, right? That persistent vigilance and that sense of worry around whether or not you're going to be treated fairly has, leads to this physiological hypervigilance. Your stress system sort of remains chronically engaged. And over time, that can wear and tear or weather your system and lead to an increase in your risk for adverse health outcomes. And so this is a schematic that may actually be familiar to some of you. Michael Liu and Neil Halfon did this back in 2003, but it's really become a way of understanding how these issues of long-term exposure to chronic stress can have impact, on pregnancy outcomes. So the life course perspective, understanding that if we want to understand any health factor really, or health differences, health status, that we can't just be looking at it sort of in a narrow way. We have to think about the fact that our health sort of develops over time, just as we develop over time. And so in thinking about pregnancy outcomes, a woman's health status and what her pregnancy outcomes are going to look like isn't just based on the 9 months of pregnancy, right? She carries her entire life experience into a pregnancy. And so we have to keep in mind what the social context or the social ecology of her life may have been that can impact what her health status may look like at the time of pregnancy. And in this, we can see the bottom line is African American women, the top line is white women, that African American women are more likely in their lifetimes to encounter greater risk factors and fewer protections over the course of their life because of longstanding social inequities than white women are, which pushes down their pushes down their health trajectory in terms of they're much less likely to experience positive health outcomes in comparison to white women, given sort of their life course experiences around multiple overlapping oppressions. And I see that we're getting close to time, right? Okay, I'm getting close to the end. So in thinking about, oops, that's my timer. There you go. In thinking about these disparity issues, I want to just emphasize that this is not, we tend to think about these in terms of population health differences. This is not an African American problem, right? This problem is a problem that is indicative of an us problem. These disparities are not the fault of the African American, population. These disparities, population health disparities, are sort of a consequence of a fault within our society, a fault within the ways in which our society has been structured, ways in which our society has decided to value different groups of people, the ways in which our society has decided to distribute resources based on certain social characteristics, right? The ways in which our society has structured itself. And that is why we are seeing, as a consequence of those sorts of decisions, why it is that certain groups of people who tend not to be in the majority, tend to be historically marginalized groups of people, tend to fare worse when it comes to their health outcomes. Preterm delivery and low birth weight cost us billions of dollars each year. Medicaid, public insurance that taxpayers pay, covers a third of birth-related costs. The US spends more in health, but has worse health outcomes. We're the only industrialized country without universal health care. And we know that countries with greater social equity have better health. So what can we do? I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm going to skip some of these slides. Thinking about what it is that you can do right now, right? So the first thing is value all people equally. It's the simple rule that you were probably taught as a child, right? Treat people the way you want to be treated, the golden rule. This is very simple, simple concept, not always simply enacted, and something that I think we all sort of need to work on. But this concept of implicit bias, we all have it, really sort of educating yourself and others about these issues, and really having those hard conversations. We've had plenty of things in the past year, the past couple of years, spark these kind of conversations, right? Really having the courage to engage in those and really taking a real hard look, at yourself and at others in your life. Recognize how racism and social inequity operate, sort of in the realms in which you operate. Where are you seeing it show up in your professional circles, for example? Identify needs and gaps in services and resources, systems and policies, and advocate. Advocate for all mothers, babies, and family. Advocate when you identify what you consider to be, have some serious questions about. Stand up. Call for a greater critical reflection on things, and get activated. Activate for systems change and for social equity. I'm going to skip this quickly. This is my final slide. Without courage, we cannot practice any other virtue with consistency. We can't be kind, true, merciful, generous, or honest. Good done anywhere is good done everywhere. As long as you're breathing, it's never too late to do some good. That's Maya Angelou. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up, and I think we've got about 7 minutes for questions or comments, and I do welcome them. And I'm sorry I had to rush through a little bit there and skip some slides, but I'm happy to share the PowerPoint. I'm happy to, you all see my email address there. I'm happy to follow up on any questions you have or any citations that I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parker Dominguez. That was wonderful. I invite people to please chat. If you have a question, I'll invite you to unmute yourself, or you can chat your question and I will ask it for you. While people are doing that, I do want to share a comment that was made 20 minutes into your talk that I think is really poignant for all of us. This was from another faculty member that says we should not ask what they are doing wrong. We should ask what we are doing wrong. And I think that is a great take-home message for all of us. So with that, so another question that's being asked by a faculty member is, this discussion always seems to be one-sided. Is there any discussion of the epigenetics of racism?
Any discussion of it?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure what they mean by one-sided, but yes, the epigenetics, and I actually did not put that in the presentation and trying to stay within the time. There's so much you could talk about, right, about this. But yeah, epigenetics has been talked about with this in terms of the ways in which there's sort of the gene, and this is not, I am not a geneticist. I'm a social worker, a public health social worker, but my understanding of it is you sort of have the underlying genome and the genome and then the phenotype, right? So with epigenetics, it's the idea of how the social environment can affect how genes get expressed in some way, right? So you have the underlying epigenome, the underlying genome, and then you have the epigenome. And so with epigenetics, it is, sort of this idea that how the social environment impacts how your underlying genetics, sort of gets expressed or sort of shapes that, can also relate to how the social environment sort of another mechanism by which the social environment could end up influencing health risk, and then, these patterns of population health differentials that we're seeing.
Great, thank you. Another question is, another question from a faculty member is, how can we help ourselves or other colleagues recognize the privilege that they have and kind of take a step back from it in caring for our patients? I think if you have any suggestions for that, I think one of your slides actually did answer that question.
How we help people recognize their privilege?
Yeah.
That is a good question. I see another one in here too. How can we convince any person to give up some privilege? Well, I think this is part of those courageous conversations, right? Sometimes we are blinded to the privilege of privilege is not recognizing your privilege, right? The privilege of privilege is not recognizing your privilege. You don't have to. And for populations that experience privilege, no matter what the sort of identity indicator may be, right? And we also have to understand we all experience privilege of some sort or another, right? We don't have single identities. We are multifaceted in the way that we identify, and certain aspects of our identity may be aspects of social privilege, and other aspects of our identity may not be, right? So I am a highly educated African American woman. So I'm African American, and that may be a source of oppression for me. And I'm also a woman, and that may be a source of oppression for me. I'm an African American woman, and that's a unique source of oppression, potentially for me. But I'm well educated, and that is a source of privilege in this society, right? So that's another thing we have to understand. It's not sort of one or the other. All of us are multifaceted, multidimensional individuals, and that's the part of valuing other people, seeing them, sort of holistically, but also recognizing if you're in a position of privilege, then that privilege puts you in a position of advantage, right? And what happens is that advantage and social status, privileged social statuses tend to be sort of identified as the norm. No one likes to say that they're privileged. That's, there's also this sense of, in our society, in the American cultural ethos, is rugged individualism, right? Every single thing that I have, I earned. I merit, the things that I have. So for you to say that I'm privileged, that means, are you somehow insinuating that I didn't earn, what it is that I have, that I don't deserve to, to have the advantages, that I sort of experience? Oftentimes our privilege is blind to us, and we don't see it as privilege, right? We see it as merit, or something that we've earned. And so it can be very hard to help people understand ways in which they're privileged. So that's where that courage can come in, and you can, for lack of a better word, check people around it when you sort of see things or hear things, right? Sort of speaking up and having people sort of question, think critically about the things that they say, about how they engage, about the assumptions they make, about other people, and not just sort of pointing the finger to other people. I think the work starts internally for every single one of us, because we're all walking around with implicit biases that affect the way that we think about things and the way we live, move, and breathe in the world. So the self-work, I think, is fundamentally important to do, probably more important than, sort of looking at other people. Start with yourself and really have an honest conversation, ongoing with yourself. And then, engage in courageous conversations with other people. I think it has to start sort of at that individual level and through our social networks.
Perfect. And thank you so much for that. And our last question is, how do you go about recognizing and promoting resiliency in your encounters and meetings with your patients or families to promote health as much as we can?
Well, in social work, we talk about the strengths perspective, right? Instead of obviously, if they're sitting in front of you, a healthcare, provider, or, me as a social worker or something like that, there's an issue, there's a reason, right? Well, why they're there. And we tend to focus on that, right? What is the problem? Why is it that you're here? But we have to sort of understand that people are not their problems, and that people persevere. They adapt, they do life. And so we focus on that strengths perspective with helping people identify what it is that they do have, what resources they do have, ways in which they have sort of overcome challenges and problems in the past, the resources, and supports that are in their lives that they can leverage to help them, in the current sort of situation, and help them understand, help them see based on their past and how they've been able to manage challenge previously, that they can do this too, right? And help them to recognize and be sort of proactive in really recognizing what their strengths are, their resources and supports are, and helping them to gain access to other resources and supports they may not have access to, but letting them know and that they can do it. They've done it in the past, and really helping them leverage their own personal agency, right? I think that's the other thing, is respecting our patients as people, respecting them for having autonomy over their lives, for being people who can think through information and can make, informed decisions, and just sort of support them and respect them in doing that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. This was a wonderful talk, and I can tell from the comments everyone really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for joining us. For people who are still on the Zoom, please go ahead and scan the QR code. We will be sending out the feedback survey soon. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and we will see you here all next week. Take care.
Thank you so much.